On the afternoon of July 3, 1863, 12,000 men began walking toward a low stone wall, and in less than an hour, the entire direction of the Civil War would be decided by what happened when they got there. Most battles end when one side breaks and runs. This one ended differently. This one ended in a way that no battle before it, and arguably no battle after it, ever would again. Robert E. Lee had built his entire military legend on doing the impossible, on taking outnumbered men and outsmarting generals who had every advantage on paper. But on this field, in this town, against this army, the thing that had always worked for him stopped working. And it stopped working in the most brutal, public, and permanent way imaginable. What happened on that third day at Gettysburg didn't just cost Lee a battle. It cost the Confederacy its momentum, its confidence, and arguably its last real shot at winning the war outright. And the way it ended, the specific, strange, almost theatrical way it ended, is something you won't find repeated anywhere else in 4 years of American fighting. By the morning of July 3rd, the Battle of Gettysburg had already ground through 2 brutal days of fighting. Lee had thrown his army at both ends of the Union line, first at the hills to the south, then at the heights to the north, and both times the Federal Army had held. Most commanders, staring at 2 days of failure, would have pulled back. Lee did the opposite. He looked at the map, looked at the center of the Union position, and became convinced that the middle was the weak point, precisely because no one would expect an attack there. His own generals disagreed. James Longstreet, his most trusted corps commander, argued as hard as a subordinate could argue with a superior in that army, telling Lee flatly that no 15,000 men could walk across that much open ground and break a fortified line. Lee overruled him, and that disagreement, the tension between a general convinced of his own instincts and a lieutenant convinced those instincts had finally run out, sets the entire stage for what followed. The plan itself sounded almost mathematically sound on paper. Confederate artillery, more guns concentrated in one place than the Army had ever fired together before, would open up on the Union center for close to 2 hours, softening the line, silencing the enemy cannon, and clearing a path for the infantry to walk through. Then, 3 divisions, close to 12,000 men in total, would step off in near-perfect formation and cross open farmland toward a small clump of trees and a low stone wall that marked the center of the Union position. It was audacity dressed up as strategy. And for the first hour, it looked like it might actually work. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate guns opened fire, and men on both sides later said they had never heard anything like it. The ground itself seemed to shake. Smoke rolled across the fields, so thick that gunners on one side often couldn't see whether their shells were landing. For close to 2 hours, the cannonade continued, one of the largest artillery bombardments ever fired on American soil up to that point. And yet something strange was happening behind the Union lines that the Confederate gunners couldn't see. Union Artillery Commander Henry Hunt had ordered his own guns to slow their return fire, then stop almost entirely, not because they were beaten, but because he wanted the Confederates to believe exactly that. He was saving his ammunition and his guns for what he knew was coming next. When the Confederate guns finally fell silent and the smoke began to clear, the men waiting in the tree line got their orders. What happened next has been painted, photographed, reenacted, and mythologized more than almost any single moment in the entire war, and for good reason. Close to 12,000 men stepped out of the trees in formation, battle flags raised, and began walking, not running, walking, across nearly a mile of open Pennsylvania farmland toward a Union line that was very much still alive. Confederate officers had drilled their men for this kind of advance their entire careers, and for the first few hundred yards, the formation held with an almost eerie precision. Soldiers on both sides who survived the day described it later as beautiful, a word that feels wrong until you understand what they meant. It looked like a parade. It looked like nothing else in the war, and everyone watching from the Union side knew exactly what was about to happen to it. The moment the Confederate lines came within range, The Union artillery that had gone quiet during the bombardment came roaring back to life, and this time there was nothing holding it back. Cannon, loaded with canister shot, essentially giant shotgun blasts, tore gaps through the advancing ranks from the sides as well as the front. Men who had marched shoulder to shoulder watched the soldier next to them simply disappear. And still, the line kept walking, closing ranks over the gaps because that was what they had trained to do, because stopping in the open was its own kind of death sentence. As they crossed a farm road roughly halfway across the field, Union infantry rose up from behind the stone wall and opened rifle fire at nearly point-blank range. What had been an organized advance became something closer to a funnel, thousands of men converging toward the one weak point in the Union line near a stand of trees, a spot that would later be given a name almost too fitting to be real. A small group of Confederates, somewhere between 100 and 200 men, led by General Lewis Armistead, actually made it across the field, over the wall, and briefly broke through the Union position. For a few minutes, the plan worked exactly as Lee had imagined it. Confederate soldiers stood inside the Union line, hand to hand with Federal troops, flags planted on captured cannon. It is remembered today as the high watermark of the Confederacy, the single furthest point Confederate forces ever advanced into the heart of Union territory during the entire war, a phrase that sounds almost poetic until you realize what it actually describes. A breakthrough that lasted only minutes before it was crushed from every direction at once. Armistead himself was shot down within feet of the guns he had just captured. Union reinforcements poured in from the flanks, and the small breakthrough that had briefly looked like victory collapsed as quickly as it had formed. What happened over the next few minutes is the part that makes this day genuinely unlike any other battle in American history, and it has almost nothing to do with the fighting itself. The survivors of the charge, the men who hadn't been killed or wounded in that mile of open ground, began walking back, not running, not routing. Walking the same way they had walked out, back across the same field littered with their own dead and dying, back toward the tree line they had left less than an hour earlier. There was no panic, no mass surrender, no rout in the way battles almost always end when an attack fails this completely. It was something closer to a funeral procession conducted under fire, and it left an impression on everyone who witnessed it that outlasted the war itself. Then came the moment that separates this day from every other defeat in the conflict. Robert E. Lee, the man whose entire reputation had been built on never publicly admitting fault, rode out onto the field to meet his returning soldiers, and instead of blaming his officers or explaining away the disaster, he told the survivors over and over that the failure was entirely his own. When one general offered to place blame elsewhere, Lee cut him off. He told his men it was his fault, that he had asked them to do more than men could do, and that the responsibility for what had just happened rested with him alone. This did not happen after other failed attacks in this war. Commanders on both sides routinely blamed subordinates, blamed timing, blamed the enemy's luck. Lee, in the middle of what may have been the worst defeat of his career, chose the opposite path, in full view of thousands of his own men. George Pickett, whose name would eventually attach itself to the entire charge despite commanding only one of the 3 divisions involved, spent the rest of his life unable to speak about that afternoon without visible pain. Decades later, when a friend suggested that Pickett write a full account of what happened, he reportedly said the Yankees deserved credit for the whole thing. A bitter, half-joking deflection from a man who had watched almost his entire division destroyed in under an hour. 2 of his brigade commanders were killed. A third was mortally wounded. By the time Pickett reported back to Lee that evening, he had no division left to speak of in any meaningful sense, and something in him seemed to break along with it. He never fully forgave Lee for what happened on that field, and years later, when someone asked him why the charge had failed, Pickett is said to have replied that he had always believed the Union Army had something to do with it, a line that carried far more grief than humor. The individual stories, scattered across that mile of open ground, are what turn a military statistic into something closer to tragedy. Brothers who had enlisted together fell within yards of each other. A color bearer for the 11th Mississippi was shot down carrying the regimental flag, and the man who picked it up from his hands was killed moments later, and the man after him as well, in a grim relay that repeated itself up and down the Confederate line as flag after flag went down and was lifted again by whoever happened to be standing closest. Union soldiers behind the stone wall later described a strange, almost unbearable silence that fell in the seconds just before the two lines finally collided, a silence that dozens of survivors from both sides independently remembered decades afterward, as if the entire battlefield had briefly held its breath before the killing resumed. The scale of what had just happened became clear almost immediately. Of the roughly 12,000 men who had crossed that field, more than half were killed, wounded, or captured within the space of less than an hour. Entire regiments that had existed that morning effectively ceased to exist by mid-afternoon. Some Confederate units lost more than two-thirds of their men in a single advance, casualty rates so severe that many of those regiments never fully recovered their fighting strength for the remainder of the war. This wasn't a battle that ground down an army over days of attrition. It was a single, defined, hour-long event that permanently altered the mathematics of what the Army of Northern Virginia could accomplish going forward, and both sides understood almost immediately that something had fundamentally shifted. What makes the ending of this day so different from virtually every other major engagement of the war is what didn't happen next. There was no Union counterattack to finish off the shattered Confederate lines, despite Lee's army being in arguably its most vulnerable position of the entire war. George Meade, the Union commander, chose caution over pursuit, a decision that has been debated by historians for more than a century and a half. There was no formal surrender on the field, no negotiated withdrawal, none of the usual punctuation marks that typically close out a major Civil War engagement. Instead, the two armies simply stared at each other across the same bloodied ground for another full day, both sides too damaged and too uncertain to make the next move, until Lee finally began withdrawing his army back toward Virginia under cover of a massive thunderstorm, a retreat so quiet and so unopposed that it almost felt anticlimactic against everything that had just occurred. There is also the matter of what almost happened but never did, the part of that afternoon that rarely makes it into the popular retelling. Confederate cavalry under J.E.B. Stuart had been maneuvering that same day several miles east of the main battlefield, attempting to swing behind the Union lines and strike the rear at the exact moment the infantry assault reached its climax at the front. Had that pincer actually closed, had Stuart's riders broken through where they intended to, the chaos behind the Union position might have turned a repelled charge into something far more catastrophic for Meade's army. Instead, Union cavalry under George Custer, then a brash young officer barely into his mid-20s, met Stuart's men in a violent close-quarters fight that ground to a standstill and kept the rear of the Union line intact. Almost no one, watching the smoke rise over the stone wall that afternoon, had any idea that a second quieter battle happening miles away had just as much bearing on whether the entire plan could have succeeded. The aftermath is where the true weight of that single hour becomes impossible to ignore. Lee's army would never again mount a major offensive into Union territory for the remainder of the war. The Confederacy's best opportunity to force a negotiated peace through a decisive victory on Northern soil had come and gone, and it had ended not in a slow, grinding defeat, but in one specific catastrophic hour that men who survived it carried with them for the rest of their lives. Survivors of the charge, on both the Union and Confederate sides, wrote about that field for decades afterward, and many of them, remarkably, eventually returned to it in peacetime, shaking hands with men they had once tried to kill in a way that few other battlefields of this war would ever witness. In the decades that followed, that field became something almost unheard of for a Civil War battleground, a place where former enemies willingly returned together rather than avoided entirely. In 1913, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, elderly veterans from both sides gathered at Gettysburg for a reunion. And at one point, men who had once stood on opposite sides of that stone wall walked toward each other across the same open ground, shook hands, and in some documented cases, embraced openly in front of a crowd of spectators and photographers. It is difficult to imagine survivors of other catastrophic engagements in this war choosing to reenact their reconciliation in such a public, physical way, walking the same ground that had swallowed so many of their friends 50 years earlier. But that is precisely what happened at the site of Pickett's charge, and nowhere else in quite the same fashion. Historians have spent a century and a half arguing over whether the charge was ever destined to fail, whether a different approach, a longer bombardment, a coordinated flank attack, or simply more caution from Lee could have changed the outcome. Longstreet spent the rest of his life defending his own objections that day, and in the bitter political climate of the post-war South, he was increasingly blamed by former Confederate officials looking for someone other than Lee to hold responsible. An irony that would have been unthinkable on the afternoon Lee himself stood in front of his men and refused to let that blame land anywhere but on his own shoulders. That refusal, more than any tactical detail of the assault itself, is part of why this particular defeat has never faded from American memory the way so many other engagements eventually did. It offered something rare in the story of this war, a moment of accountability delivered in the exact instant it would have been easiest to avoid. That, ultimately, is what makes the third day at Gettysburg unlike anything else in American military history. It wasn't the largest battle. It wasn't even the bloodiest single day of the war. But it was the moment where a general's entire philosophy of daring, unpredictable warfare met its absolute limit, where an army walked to its own destruction with a discipline that turned catastrophe into something almost solemn, and where the commander responsible chose, in front of his own broken ranks, to take full ownership of what had just happened rather than deflect it. No other major engagement of the Civil War ended with quite that combination of scale, restraint, and reckoning. And that combination is exactly why, more than a century and a half later, people are still trying to understand what really happened in that single hour on that Pennsylvania field.